Hey, come map with me while I talk through some thoughts on our current cadence with the Path of Exile leagues. I've been seeing this reoccurring pattern where we are all very excited for a league. We hope it's going to be good, GGG tells us it's going to be good, and then we continually have frustrations with it. And every time we have frustrations, they have to reveal a what we're working on patch. This time around, the what we're working on was more highly wished for than I think ever before. But I have been seeing a trend where GGG releases patches that feel like they need like just a couple weeks to be properly cooked before they give it to us. I think especially it's difficult with this league because the issues were so blatant. Like the fact that the architect deletes your progress is such a blatant issue. It's not like they needed us to tell them that that was a problem. They should have known that that was a problem. Same with a lot of the confusing mechanics. It feels as though they just have people who understand the systems very well testing it, and so they don't see these things. But it does seem fairly obvious, like they should have been able to catch those things. And so for the last several leagues, GGG has been doing what we're working on. And maybe they did this before, but I've only kept up with it very intensely in the last couple leagues. With Keepers of the Flame, there was an issue where Aelith was made of paper, as the Reddit liked to joke. And so you had to defend Aelith from the oncoming Breach Swarm. However, she would die to random range attacks from across the map. The Hive Fortress would put out a big wave of damage that evasion defense systems didn't seem to survive, even though evasion is a totally valid defense in Path of Exile 1. They had to make some updates throughout the league. We even saw with Abyss that they had to make some updates to Abyss where the rares were weaker. They toned them down. The degen pools still exist. They're still kind of painful. Not nearly as bad as the rare mobs were when Rise of the Abyssal first came out. When that league first came out, it was a good league, but the Abysses were scary. They were scary and they were difficult, and in some ways they still are. And so I think balancing like that is a little bit harder to see, and now they have more people balancing, so maybe it'll be easier to catch. But it does feel like GGG is relying on us in that first week or couple days to tell them if they did a good job or not, and to tell them where to change. And this has really shaped the culture we have as a community with GGG. I think this is partially why the Reddit can feel so doomer-esque and pessimistic. It's not actually that it is pessimistic, it's just that because GGG listens to us, we want to give more feedback. You know, we're excited to give feedback if we think that it can make a difference. We have a voice in this game, and that is a huge privilege and something that GGG has really done a great job with. But it also means that there's a lot more space for complaints. A lot more complaints are seen as valid because they can be transformed into good game changes. And I think that is relatively healthy. But I also worry that GGG has put themselves in a spot where they're okay with releasing slightly bad league mechanics because they know that they can rely on the community to give them feedback about it. And maybe that's not true. Maybe that's a false assumption. Maybe I'm just projecting. But I have seen a lot of comments that have talked about the fact that they put out these mechanics that are weaker or the monsters are too strong, and then they have to adjust later. And so they overtune stuff in a way that I wish we could avoid. You know, I wish we could have avoided the last couple weeks where Fate of the Vaal felt like obvious design issues that should have been accounted for. It almost feels like several stages of grief where when we start out, we're in the honeymoon phase, it's all novelty, it's all exciting, it feels good because in the early acts, we're gonna struggle anyway, so the fact that the league mechanic is a struggle is totally expected. But then as time goes on, we realize that, wait, maybe this isn't supposed to be as much of a struggle as it really is, and maybe this won't get any better. And then that results in GGG responding and us handling those adjustments to see if they meet our expectations, if they help the mechanic, if they're worse, what have you. And an interesting thing about Fate of the Vaal is it feels like a mechanic that should have been in PoE 1, whereas Keepers of the Flame, the new Breach, felt like a league that should have been in PoE 2. Keepers of the Flame mechanic was very simple and relatively shallow, and this Fate of the Vaal feels very deep and very difficult to understand, which is typically where PoE 1 sits. That was where a lot of my disappointment with the PoE 2 experience came from, is that PoE 2 is meant to solve the issues that PoE 1 has. It's meant to be easier to understand. It's meant to be catered towards newer players. And so for these glaring issues to exist in PoE 2 is very disappointing. What I will say is that the changes to the temple have actually been really good. I think the loot seems to be better. Clarity in the temple seems a little bit better. It's still a little bit confusing. There's still some issues that I think could be addressed, such as the way that paths work. Paths seem to be able to do whatever they want. They have no rules. As well as the destabilization, I think, is a little bit unclear and punishing. I keep wondering if there's a way to make that mechanic so that you see like a about to destabilize state, and then you have an opportunity to adjust it before it actually happens. Just because I know people are having a really tough time getting past frustration with the destabilization, how random it feels. I heard Zizarin say earlier that he wishes that the leagues didn't have like a full month of extra time, but had like an extra 2 weeks. And I wonder how much of these problems would be solved with an extra 2 weeks, or are solved because we are all here to complain about them. A lot of people were joking on my YouTube video that we're the beta testers, and we are the beta testers, but also we shouldn't have to be. What could be a very successful Fate of the Vaal mechanic be sullied by a first impression that we have at the beginning of the league? A lot of people have already written off the Fate of the Vaal mechanic. If having written off that could have been avoided by an extra 2 weeks of development, they should have definitely done that. If those 2 weeks would have just been used to add more rooms, then that wouldn't have solved the problem. Maybe there's an opportunity there for them to reevaluate how they test and how they discern what a good experience is and how clear the play will be for the players. But I don't think there is like a one-size-fits-all solution for the correct cadence for Path of Exile. If you stretch out the timelines, then people who only play one game won't get as much playtime. For me personally, this feels like a lot of Path of Exile, but I also haven't fully burnt out on it yet. I don't totally mind it. And if the development team thinks they can handle this cadence, then I think it's their choice. I don't think any cadence will be a good solution for anyone. It was easy with one game, but with two, it's a lot more difficult because of the overlap between the player races. And if you ask me if I would rather have the style where they release what feels like slightly underdeveloped patches with well knowing that they would resolve all the problems within a week, or at least address the immediate pain within a week, versus a more developed league but then not listening to feedback at all, I guess I'd probably rather have the one where they listen to feedback. The fact that we have a company willing to listen to us is really good for us as players and the game. And GGG always addresses our disappointment. You know, when the Endgame wasn't done, they explicitly said it. When leagues were delayed, they explicitly said it, that they were sorry and they didn't want it to happen again. Especially even with the DDoS attacks, when Secrets of the Atlas Mercenaries came out in PoE 1, they owned up to that as well. There were console issues and they said that. But I also wonder if it's what they want as well. Like, do they want to release slightly unfinished patches and then have to fix it later, or would they rather just move on to the next patch? It seems like they're okay with work that's like not really done and then relying on us to tell them what needs to be done, which personally is where some of the fatigue comes from for me. When we talk about fatigue between the leagues, it's not really about whether I'm tired of PoE in general. It's about being frustrated over the roughness of the patches and just having to work through that frustration in a game that otherwise feels like pretty fleshed out. Like, the actual like build diversity right now is really good. The balance of this game is so good that I actually want to make so many builds that I don't have the time to do it. And so in a polished game, then we have these like new mechanics that don't feel quite done and they're relying on us, and I think that's more tiring than the actual game. I think if this was a really fun league, that we wouldn't feel tired. But I think there's been more discussions about league cadence and PoE burnout simply because the leagues have been a little bit easier to write off for completely different reasons. Keepers of the Flame, the new breach mechanic, was easier to write off because it was so simple. Like, once you had done the mechanic once, you had done it. This one is easier to write off because it's too complicated. The second you try to understand it, you have to invest another 2 hours into maps to get your next temple run. And I still don't understand why they haven't adjusted that. Why haven't they made it so that you get a beacon, you only need 5 beacons to power the thing, or 4 beacons. It seems like such an easy adjustment that they just haven't made yet. I don't know if it's because of the art assets or what. Very bizarre to me that that is the one criticism they aren't addressing here. I know that a lot of people are going to say, yes, they're okay with underperforming skills. They're okay with difficult league mechanics. They're okay with things that aren't quite done because they've seen it happen so much. But I do wonder if that's how they feel at GGG too. Because I've seen that sentiment a lot just because it's a pattern for them, but just because it's a pattern doesn't mean that they're trying to repeat it. And so much of it feels like they play so much of their own game, they understand it so well that they can't see from the perspective of people who haven't interacted with those systems and don't understand it, and that's how we also end up with UI that doesn't feel like it encapsulates all the information it needs to encapsulate. It's not about hand-holding, it's not about like not reading and not seeing all the information. Like, just because the information is there doesn't mean it's communicated clearly. The whole thing about UI is that it should kind of speak for itself. And that doesn't always work in games, and I don't want like a sterile corporate UI. I want something fun and interesting, but I also want it to feel like we can have mastery over the mechanic. When it comes to like, the passive tree, this is big and it's overwhelming and it's difficult, but it's very clear how to gain mastery over this mechanic. And when you look at the Fate of the Vaal Temple, it is not clear how to get mastery over that mechanic. It's almost hard to understand how they went from the Pee-wee 1 League, where it felt like it took 2 minutes to understand the mechanic, to this temple, where it takes 10 hours to understand. So in a way, you could call this game development style reactionary. It feels like they're constantly giving us something, waiting for feedback, seeing where the issues are, and then reacting, versus proactive development, where they might have an understanding of where the pain points might be, or maybe they don't, and maybe that's just their way of keeping... What? Ugh. Whatever, okay, alright, that's fine, that's cool, thanks game. Maybe that's just their way of keeping the player base engaged, but I would be surprised if players really felt like the fatigue came from playing both games, came from going to league too soon, and not actually from having to understand a difficult mechanic or feeling like they're getting something that's not fully fleshed out, that's difficult to understand, that forces them to reevaluate what they know. Because if they're expressing a sentiment of it's too much, it's too fast, I can't imagine that's actually coming from having to create new builds. And I have to imagine it's more so coming from having to understand the lead mechanic and then evaluate its strengths and weaknesses. Especially because Path of Exile 2 doesn't really have great goals for the player. In Path of Exile 1, if we had multiple leagues back to back, it probably wouldn't feel as difficult, just because there's so many tangible bosses and challenges, and like completing the Atlas is something very real for you to get a build to do, so it wouldn't even feel like an overwhelm because you know exactly where you want to go in that game. Path of Exile 2, once you get to the end, you don't really have a goal, so it's the feeling of uncertainty takes over, and the feeling of aimlessness and uncertainty compounding each other in the end game with the Fate of the Vaal mechanic. And it also makes it a lot slower and longer because the Fate of the Vaal mechanic takes you out of the map and then brings you back into it in the middle. If you choose to do it this way, which is kind of the way it's designed to be done, where you do it in the middle of the map, it makes it feel even slower. And so I think that if the pacing was a bit faster, or if people had some sort of pinnacle boss that they would use to make their build stronger as a goal or motivation. I know that right now we have Atziri, but I'll be honest with you, Atziri doesn't feel like a very good goal in this game. I think many people would agree. Because the temple is frustrating, because it takes so long to build that up, I don't think that most people will want to do Atziri even this league, unfortunately. It makes me wonder if this league was put in Path of Exile 1 a month after we had Keepers, people would probably play it and feel a little bit less burnt out than they do in Path of Exile 2, just because the pace of Path of Exile 2 is meant to be so much slower and in some ways more grueling. I do actually like the slower pace of Path of Exile 2, but it's definitely grueling. Having a mechanic that exacerbates that and highlights that part of the game doesn't help. Doesn't help at all. I don't think people will have this feeling of like, oh, I've played both leagues and now I'm burnt out in the future, so much as we do right now, where we don't have a great end goal in mind. We don't have something to push towards with our builds. We're just building to build. We're playing to play. And we're also not used to this cadence yet, and neither is GGG probably. I imagine we'll all kind of fall into our own patterns of what leagues we want to play, or if we want to do both, or maybe skip a league, or how we'll manage all of it happening kind of at the same time. But I think most of the fatigue is centered around this league and not necessarily around Path of Exile in general. Path of Exile 2 really sacrificed its sense of discovery, in my opinion. The Atlas doesn't have a sense of discovery because you kind of already know what's going to be on it and you just have to fight to get it. The temple doesn't have a sense of discovery because you can't really prove hypotheses right or wrong in the temple. It's just a little bit too confusing. The maps don't really have a sense of discovery. I think next league will have a better sense of discovery because we'll have the Endgame or we'll have Act 5, maybe both. And all of those will give us something new to be excited about and sink our teeth into. Eventually this game will transition, like PoE1 did, into something that has something to discover, into something that has something to master. And we're all continuously mastering it every league that comes along. But I am generally very optimistic about this game. I think this league is a little bit easy to be discouraged because the mechanic is so confusing and pretty tiring and very slow. And it's slowed down the game a lot. Not that I mind the game being slow, but this is a pace that I was not prepared for. That's probably why a lot of people are skipping the mechanic as well. But I still enjoyed the acts a ton. I mean, I've been through them 3 times so far this league and we're 1 week in, so that's a little absurd. But it is actually the best part of the game, so maybe it's fine that it worked out that way. And maybe next league I'll just have 1 character because fingers crossed, 0.5 will have an endgame that's the best part of the game. I'm feeling good about it. I'm a little bit calmed down now that they have some fixes in for the temple and buffs to loot and all of that. I'm still not getting enough skill gems and support gems, which is frustrating, but I'm hopeful they'll buff that too. So those are my current thoughts on the league, the mechanics, and the cadence, on just generally about how we give feedback to GGG and how they get feedback from us. So let me know your thoughts down below. Please like the video, it helps me out a lot, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!